Few moments in D&D are as exciting or thrilling as a great combat encounter.
But delivering those memorable experiences is a difficult challenge as a dungeon master. So today, we're sharing our tips and tricks for creating amazing battles in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Welcome, Dungeon Masters. My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes.
And today we're taking a look at designing combat encounters in D&D 5e.
We love creating combat encounters where the player characters' lives hang in the balance. That moment of suspense where they must use their intelligence, strength, and cunning in order to survive.
With combat encounters being such a large part of the game, it's really exciting for the players to get to throw down their best spells and abilities and really get to use all that cool stuff on their character sheet.
Especially when they get to interact with the monsters that they get to face. However, creating challenging combat encounters is a really time-consuming and a difficult task, especially for new dungeon masters. So we're going to be looking at some of our tips and tricks for how to do this, especially when you have players that are eager for a fight and looking for worthy foes to test their mettle against.
Designing combat encounters is a skill. And although half of the combat encounter is going to be how it plays out at the table, it's still always good to have a great plan.
We're going to be looking at how we plan a combat encounter in our own campaigns. And we're going to cover this across 3 videos. In the first part, which we're looking at today, we're going to be talking about the narrative conflict that lies at the heart of every combat encounter.
The second video we're doing is about the mechanics of combat difficulty and choosing monsters based on their challenge rating.
And in the final part in this series, we're going to be looking at creating an epic and memorable location to set the stage for your combat encounters. One where the terrain and environment play a big part of how the player characters and their monsters have their final showdown.
So we're going to start by discussing what an encounter actually is. So let's get rolling.
A great encounter doesn't necessarily have to be a combat, but one of the things that's essential to it is that every encounter presents the player characters with a problem or a conflict that they must resolve somehow.
And the player characters are opposed by a compelling foe or monster.
Or some other obstacle. In any case, the player character's actions determine how this situation is resolved and the dramatic consequences that come about as a result.
And you want it set in a memorable and awesome location.
A compelling problem, interesting opposition, dramatic consequences, and an exciting location. These are the 4 building blocks from which every encounter we create is based upon, whether or not it's a combat encounter.
Any encounter can become a combat encounter when the player characters decide that to achieve their goals, they need to solve their problems with violence.
And indeed, sometimes violence is thrust upon the player characters, and the question is more about their survival than whether or not they'll solve it with violence.
Keep your mind open to the idea that encounters can be solved with more than just violence, sometimes by outsmarting your enemy, by bypassing the situation, or finding other ways around it.
Don't be discouraged if your players choose violence over other options presented to them. Presenting those options to your players is your role as Dungeon Master. They're the ones that get to make the choices, and that's the most meaningful and rewarding part of Dungeons & Dragons. In many cases, the player characters will choose combat because it's exciting and fun, and they are itching for a fight. As long as you've presented them with those alternative options, you're doing a good job. Every combat encounter has these 4 core components: the problem, the opposition, the resolution, and the location. But how do we decide actually what each of those is going to be?
When you start building your combat encounter, the first thing you want to think of is your creative concept.
This is going to be the thing that helps us define the narrative, mechanics, and location that really make the combat encounter come to life. And this concept that you start with can be almost anything. We could actually be starting with a dramatic location that we have in mind, like the caldera of a volcano or a bridge across a great gorge.
You could also build the entire creative concept around a specific foe or monster that you love in the monster manual.
Yeah, maybe you're flipping through the monster manual and you're just struck by a piece of art that you saw there. Sometimes I've come up with a creative concept just because I found a map or was thinking of an image or a picture of a cool location. And I said, that would be a cool moment to have a fight. And sometimes you want to build around this kind of narrative set piece, like you might want to have a chase scene, or a siege, or an encounter where the player characters have to stop a ritual, or face the elite shock troops, or take out the minions. Any one of these things can be the seed by which the rest of the encounter is defined. It's your core creative concept. And this concept is so important that it's worth writing it down and saying, this is what I want to achieve. This is the feeling that I want to create as we fill in the rest of the building blocks of our encounter.
Write it down. I'm going to make that appear on the bottom of the screen right here. Write it down. Remember to write it down. It only needs to be a sentence or two and maybe a few pictures that you found online that represent your combat encounter.
When I was making a combat encounter for Dungeons of Drakkenheim, I just wrote down an interesting challenge. Who can defeat the trolls first? When we start to think about the player's goals, this is how we start creating the conflict that's going to underscore our entire combat encounter.
Using the player's bonds, flaws, and other things that they've written into their backstory to really define what the combat encounter is going to look like is a key element to designing your encounter.
Regardless of what your concept or creative ideas might be, your encounter still needs some sort of conflict. This is when the player characters have a specific goal in mind, and some other force emerges to oppose them in achieving that goal. The most important thing about identifying the source of the conflict is just writing it down.
One of my PCs has a love interest throughout the campaign who has been kidnapped by an evil cult who is using that as a sacrifice to summon an evil demon.
In a famous scenario where the player characters are given a task to retrieve a pie from a dungeon. There's a single room in this dungeon where the pie rests, guarded by an orc. The players want the pie, the orc wants the pie, conflict. One of the big challenges with creating encounter-based conflicts is that as dungeon masters, we often fixate on the big picture, the big story of the evil villain who wants to create this evil, horrible ritual. That's all fine and good, but we have to zoom in a little bit to figure out what the conflicts are going to be in our individual encounters. If our villain needs to pull off an evil ritual, they're going to need some victims. So in this scene, they're going to kidnap somebody.
And that conflict comes from the fact that the person they kidnap might be a best friend or loved one of the player characters.
The villain needs to kidnap a victim. The player characters have a relationship with that victim. Conflict ensues. What happens next?
Conflict might be as simple as the player characters need to get into somewhere, and there's people who do not want them to enter that location.
They're trying to take control of a tower from a vicious group of harpies who previously kicked them out of it.
They need to find a specific item located deep in a dragon's lair.
The player characters need to get information out of somebody who might not be willing to give it to them. Or, as is often the case, the player characters want to kill some monsters to take their stuff, and those monsters do not want their stuff taken and do not want to be killed.
Conflict.
The opposition is just as important as the player characters and their motivations. These things are yin and yang to each other. And writing them both down of saying, this is what one group wants, this is what the other group wants, and making sure that those things really butt heads. The more difficult you make it for that conflict to be resolved through words or diplomacy, the more likely you're going to get a combat encounter.
The world of D&D has many magical and incredible creatures, all of which share one thing in common. They want to continue existing.
Most of them share one thing in common. There are some totally nihilistic creatures out there that hate their own existence. But those creatures are few and far between. Even intelligent undead creatures still have a self-preservation instinct to them. So often I see dungeon masters create combat encounters with a horde of orcs that feels like it doesn't have any meaning or stakes because all of those orcs are willing to throw their lives away like they don't mean anything. And even a determined and brave and trained warrior understands that their life has value and that it's not worth simply throwing it away for a hopeless cause.
With that, let's talk about the resolution of our combat encounters.
When two forces come into conflict, ultimately there will be a resolution. There will be consequences. And figuring out what these consequences will be requires asking ourselves, what is at stake?
A fun clash of swords becomes a narrative masterpiece when there's something at stake. If you have conflict, if you have both sides wanting something out of the combat encounter, it now has more value.
The thing to remember with the resolution of a combat encounter is very rarely in Dungeons & Dragons do we want to ask ourselves the questions, will the player characters survive? But rather, how will the player characters survive? Sometimes the answer to this question is through great sacrifice and loss, and that makes the encounter have meaning.
Sometimes when you're designing an encounter, you might not even plan how the player characters will survive. Part of the fun is watching them come up with ways to survive the combat encounters. It is really interesting to see your players come up with creative solutions and using their own goals to achieve victory over the combat encounter.
To prevent an encounter from having a foregone conclusion, it's useful to write down a couple possible outcomes for every encounter. Rather than thinking of every encounter as ending on a fixed note, if you write down a short list of saying, the player characters might die, they succeed, the enemy escapes, the player characters have to flee. Thinking in terms of possible resolutions, rather than an absolute, is going to open your mind to all the different ways your story could branch out. It makes every scene have an interesting narrative stake at play, and really helps work against your own impulse to potentially railroad a set of foregone conclusions.
I one time ran an encounter with an adult white dragon, and I had written down in my notes, adult white dragon is stupid and loves food. This means that if the player characters could exploit that in some way, that was one way to get an advantage in that combat encounter. I didn't drop many hints for that, but they did figure it out, and they threw food into the dragon's lair, gaining them the surprise in that combat encounter.
In contrast, I've designed combat encounters that I imagine the player characters were going to win a glorious victory that completely turned around on their heads and end up with one of the player characters bleeding out dead and the rest of them fleeing across a river. Sometimes encounters end in a completely unexpected way. The player characters try to negotiate, they run, someone surrenders. How can they make a deal? Be open to these things. Going into the design of your combat encounters without the assumption that it's going to grind out to the last hit point is really empowering for you as a dungeon master.
Monty, what's your favorite combat encounter that you've ever ran?
I honestly think the combat encounter in the Red Hand of Doom, where that was really early in our campaign, where you were all evacuating the village, is a combat encounter that I was particularly proud of, because that one had so many different moving parts, and the question of that combat encounter was really, really clear. The player characters were woken up in the middle of the night. A group of hobgoblin raiders had appeared on the west bank of the village they were staying in. The player characters knew in this moment that they had little hope of saving the west bank before it was consumed in flames. So immediately they decided their goal was going to be to get across the river and evacuate as many of the citizens as they could in the time that they had. This was the goal that the player characters had developed on their own based on the scenario that I'd presented in front of them. They could have decided that they wanted to try to fight off the raid entirely, but the players decided that their goal in this case was saving those lives. That fed into the entirety of how the combat encounter stretched out from there. What the player characters didn't know is that the goal of this raid was to scare the villagers. The hobgoblin raiders were the vanguard for a larger force, and this raid's purpose was to test the defenses, sow terror, and gather a little bit of reconnaissance and information beforehand. So the raiders knew that they didn't need to give their lives. They just wanted to cause as much damage as they possibly could and escape with their lives. This meant that the raiders were willing to be pretty cagey with the players. There was a lot of running and running through the streets and back and forth, because the objective of the foes was to cause terror.
Yeah, I think that became more clear as we went on, and every time that we would start to damage the hobgoblins, they would start to retreat. And actually, I remember the players around the table getting really frustrated in a good way on how difficult it was to actually catch up to the hobgoblins and kill them, because every time we would start to lay down some damage on them, those hobgoblins would move back and others would come forward and start attacking us.
All the while, the hobgoblins were lighting buildings on fire and trying to corner vulnerable people that the player characters would take inordinate risks to try to save.
You actually, you caused us to split the party, and that's what ended up killing one of our player characters. Is our goal was to evacuate, and with all of the buildings on fire, we had people in multiple buildings screaming from the windows. So we branched out, and I remember me and Josh tried to take on 2 separate buildings, and then on the way back, Josh got caught by the hobgoblins.
What struck me so much about this encounter is that at a certain point in this encounter, everyone at the table realized that the lives of the people in the village were more important than the lives of their own characters. And everyone was willing to lay down their lives to buy time for other people to escape. In this moment, one of our player characters playing a Tabaxi rogue found an opportunity to take a surgical strike at one of the hobgoblin leaders and assassinate them. They stayed one round too long in order to take out this leader. And as a result, they themselves could not escape.
Josh made a call there that actually saved the rest of our lives, because the leader that he took out was a spellcaster.
Yes, that's true.
And the spellcaster was coming up in the initiative order.
And was going to hit you all with a fireball and a bunch of the evacuating citizens.
Yes.
Yes.
So Josh, instead of using all of his movement to move as far as he could, he was going to take the dash action, but instead he moved his normal amount, turned around, and fired that last shot, killing the spellcaster, saving everybody, and then getting chopped down. Letting the players come up with their reasons for the combat all make it much more interesting. And the example that we just talked about, there was a lot more at stake than just kill the hobgoblins. We had prisoners, we had an evacuation, we had buildings on fire, we had an entire town that needed to be protected that we had come to love. We had ourselves that were outnumbered, and as we realized that we needed ourselves to evacuate, we had to make some pretty harsh calls on what to do in that situation. And it turned into a much more interesting combat encounter than just, here's hobgoblins, here's a moderate combat encounter for you guys to fight down to the last hit point, hooray, you're victorious, which would have been fun, but it wouldn't have been nearly as memorable. Look for inspiration for your combat encounters by looking at cool images of locations online. I actually do that a lot. Finding cool monsters that you want to use, knowing what the goals, flaws, and bonds of your players are so that you can incorporate that into the combat encounter. You mix all of these together and you're going to have an awesome combat encounter that's going to be remembered for years.
The interesting thing too is when those player characters' goals and bonds and flaws become secondary conflicts to the main conflict, because the player characters within themselves have their ideals and their flaws and bonds pull them in different directions about how they want to resolve this combat situation.
If you have some narratively awesome combat encounters, we'd love to hear about them in the comments below, so please share them with us. So this has been our look at designing combat encounters in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. We hope that you feel inspired to bring some narrative elements into your next combat encounter.
And of course, this is just the first part of our series on designing combat encounters for D&D 5e. Stay tuned for the second part in this series. We're going to be looking at the mechanics of combat encounter difficulty and choosing monsters by their challenge rating. And the third part in this series, we're going to be looking at creating an evocative location to set the stage for your encounters.
If you want to see Monty and myself implement some of these tactics in our own game, you can watch our live stream Dungeons of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on twitch.tv/dungeon_dudes.
And prior episodes of the campaign are available right here on our YouTube channel.
And of course, if you want more tips for running combat, we have a great video on that right up over here.
And of course, for you players that are looking for some creative combat tactics, we have a whole video on those right over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.